My name is Sean Stimson. I'm a senior solicitor at the Redfern Legal Centre's International Student Legal Service. As we will be recording this webinar this evening, could we please ask that you turn off your cameras and your microphones? And if you have any questions, you can place them in the chat.
My name is Peter. I work with Sean at the International Student Legal Service. Redfern Legal Centre acknowledges that we work on Aboriginal land, traditionally the home of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We would like to pay respects to elders past and present.
Thank you, Peter. I think we'd also like to thank Study New South Wales for their continued support of the International Student Legal Service here at Redfern Legal Centre. So thank you for that.
We're seeing, Sean, I think you would agree, an increase in international students who are experiencing issues caused by the closure or partial closure of the education provider. So could you explain a bit more about what a partial closure would be?
So partial closure may be that the education provider is still offering studies. The studies could be to domestic students only, or it could be that they've removed their international student program completely or partially. So it could be that your course has been removed or all international students' courses has been removed.
Yeah. That'd be a really stressful situation. So what if you were an international student and your college has closed down or stopped offering courses, your course to international students? What do you think would be the sort of first step you would take, the number one thing we would tell our clients to do?
Yeah, I mean, certainly an education provider themselves have obligations. So every education provider has to adhere to certain legal requirements. If an education provider is ceasing to provide a course of studies or ceasing to trade in their entirety, then they're obligated to notify a government organisation. It's called the Tuition Protection Scheme, or TPS, as I'm probably going to refer to it as we move forward. They must do so within 2 working days. Okay. So there must be that notification. If they've notified TPS, all the students, they usually would know within a 5-day period whether or not TPS is involved.
Okay, so what I understand that they will help you do a few things, or what sort of things will they do? Will they get a student a new course, or what happens then? And if they do give you a new course, the TPS, what if you don't want to go to that particular education provider, or you don't like the location, or you don't think it's a good course for you? What would you do?
I think if we're mapping it out, and certainly as we provide to students, what the obligations of the education provider are is actually that they should find you that course. So they should be saying, okay, we're closing, we're ceasing to trade, or we're ceasing to provide this course. They should say, however, here's an alternate course that you can enroll in. If they fail to do so, then TPS effectively take on that role.
Okay, so it's the education provider first, and they're supposed to look after you. Correct. And then if they can't or they don't, then you'd go to the TPS.
Yeah, that's right. And based on your question, if you don't like what was being offered either by the education provider, who's ceasing trading or partially ceasing trading, or TPS, you can actually source your own education provider. It has to be like for like, obviously, if you're, whatever you're studying with the education provider that's partially closed or closed, it must be a similar course to that.
And if the TPS organises that for the student, how long does that take for them to do it?
Yeah, usually between 2 to 4 weeks. So it's reasonably quick. And the reason for that is, as we are all aware, the international student has a sub 500 class visa. A sub 500 class visa have conditions that are attached to it, and those conditions are that they must have a valid COE.
That's really important.
It
isn't
it? Massively important. So if a student is looking at sourcing their own education provider, they must be sure that they are provided that COE, confirmation or certificate of enrolment, because that is key to remaining lawful in Australia.
So you've got your new education provider, you've got your COE, but you've already paid your fees in advance. I mean, that would be really stressful as well, like not knowing what's going to happen with those fees. So let's say I've paid my fees 6 months in advance and my education provider closes down after 2 months. What happens with the rest of that money?
It's referred to as an unspent component of your fees. So if we use a scenario, so somebody enrolled in their course of studies which commenced in February, as an example, and was due to complete in June, July, and they've only received 1 week or 2 weeks of study, then the unspent component, so the unspent component being the bit that you haven't received, has to be refunded. Now, the education provider is obligated to refund that. And if they don't, then TPS would certainly be able to assist in the recovery, or they may be able to actually refund that component themselves.
And how quickly would you get your fees back if that was a situation? So you could pay your new education provider?
Yeah, it's usually within about 30 days.
Okay, so it's quite quick.
It is reasonably quick. I mean, 30 days in the situation that our clients are seeing does seem like an eternity.
Yeah, it would.
Yeah, it's that type of time frame.
So that seems like a few steps, and we have got an excellent fact sheet on the tuition protection scheme, that TPS for international students, which you can download from the Redfern Legal Centre's website. There's a few other things that are really important if you're studying an international student, and it's something about, I think people want to make sure that they have their records, that their learning and their study has been acknowledged and recognised. If my college has closed down and I'm an international student, what do I do about getting those records?
Yeah, that's a great question, and certainly what we've seen is sometimes the education provider hasn't been able to provide those records to students. Again, they're obligated under legislation, under law, to keep current and accurate records of students'
and
studies.
Who maintains that or looks after that? Is there a sort of government organisation that looks after that?
Yeah, there is. I mean, essentially the legislation says the education provider must keep those records, but there's an external, the organisation, the acronym is ASQA, ASQA, and they should be being provided the records of students. It may be that ASQA actually hold those records. So I think our recommendations would be, if they haven't received their student records, their prior learning, then they should contact ASQA, because ASQA may already have those.
Okay, so if they don't have them and the education provider is completely closed down and they might be bankrupt or insolvent trading or just no longer there anymore, is there any what could you do to try and get those records?
Yeah, if they're in the hands of the administrators, so if an education provider is ceasing to trade, quite often they'll be placed in the hands of an administrator, and essentially the role of the administrator is to tie up all the loose ends of that particular education provider. And they have obligations. The administrators actually have obligations to creditors, but also to the students. So they should provide records that are kept within the database of that education provider.
That sounds a little bit complicated. I just don't know, like if I was a student and being so stressed at the time of all this happening and your education provider closing down, what sort of things would I write to the administrator? Or like, that seems really complicated.
It is complicated, and you're absolutely right. And it's something that we considered when we were talking about what's happening with our clients, and certainly what we've been providing our clients to assist them in recovering their records. So with that in mind, we actually have drafted a template letter that would be sent to the administrators. And and that sits within those resources that you mentioned, Peter. So
that's great.
Yeah.
And it's all ready to fill out. I just put my details in and then I can send it off.
There's a couple of blank spots that are quite apparent for, what needs to be completed. But if a student were to complete that and then send it to the administrator, that would certainly prompt them to provide those records.
So we've changed education providers, we've got our fees refunded from the TPS, we have our records to go forth, so our prior studies been recognised and we have all those details. But you might have sort of suffered some financial loss maybe, or something's happened that is made because of the misconduct or the closure of the education provider means I feel like I need some compensation. What would those sort of compensation things be if we were sort of thinking about?
That's a great question, and it's probably it probably would need further consideration. I think, because it's very hard for us to say with absolute certainty whether or not somebody would be eligible to receive compensation or potentially damages for the failure of an education provider. I think in general terms, there's perhaps a claim either in consumer law or in contract law. Consumer law, in this case, I think the most effective way, cost-effective and easiest way to try to recover any losses or damages would be through the New South Wales Civil Administrative Tribunal, or NCAT for short.
Yeah, and they have a consumer division that sort of deals with these sort of claims, and it's quite inexpensive, isn't it, to lodge a claim?
Yeah, for students, including international students, it sits under $20. I think it may even be around $15.
That's pretty good. Yeah, you can do that. I mean, you might need some legal help to prepare those documents or to sort of figure out what you could claim.
Yeah, I think that's why I say I think you'd really need to consider what claim you may have, because it could sit in different areas of law, and your starting point is really to quantify, to actually work out how much you are actually owed, if anything. So I think the starting point would be, what are your losses? And how have you calculated those losses?
And you've got quite a bit of time to consider if you've suffered any damage or loss that you need to be compensated for. So that's probably not the first step that you'd take. How long would you have to do anything about that compensation?
Yeah, so in each of them, I mean, we mentioned consumer law and we mentioned contract. So in consumer law, if you're pursuing through NCAT, the tribunal, you have 3 years. If you're pursuing in contract, you have 6 years to pursue a claim.
So you've got plenty of time to think about that later. So the most important things we would say to clients would be to maintain their confirmation of enrolment, to obtain their records, and to seek to make sure that they're validly in the country by having that confirmation enrolment and getting a new education provider. I think that would be the most important things to think. The first steps, basically, Sean. Like, if we're going to be in a stressful situation, we need to break it down into steps and do one thing at a time. So, what would the step 1, 2, 3 we would say to a student in this situation? What would they do?
I think for most students, certainly those that we've been advising, certainly we say to them, what is it that you want to achieve? And most of them want to be able to complete their studies. So in order to be able to complete your studies, you have to have an education provider to attend.
And that's when that confirmation of enrolment comes in, isn't it?
It's really important. Yeah, absolutely. And also your recognition of prior learning, so that you're not repeating something that you've already learned.
And you've already paid for as well.
You have already paid for. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if there's a component, as we spoke on, that hasn't yet been received, then you can obviously have a refund of that. I suppose the other thing to consider, if you are looking at refunds, and we did touch on this just now, is that there is certain steps that you should also take. We don't think it's the priority. I think the priority is always going to be able to ensure that you remain lawful and you have a valid COE. That's the most important thing. Certainly, as our clients have already said to us, I think thereafter, you can look at those, those particular claims, and you wouldn't go straight to, to NCAT, nor would you go straight to court.
No.
You would try to engage with the education provider if they're still trading. But again, you need to know the amount that you're trying to recover from them. So once you have that figure, you could write a letter of demand as an example and say, I'm owed X amount of money for the reasons. If they don't pay, then you look at your next options, either being NCAT or through the court.
I think that sounds like something you perhaps need to contact us to speak about if you were wanting to pursue that claim and you didn't know what to do next.
Yeah.
Or if there is anything you're having trouble with, claiming you're getting your records or claiming a refund or dealing with the TPS. Well, I think we'd say to make an appointment with us at International Student Legal Service.
I think if after you follow the steps, I think the resources, why we created the resources, were in mind that it's almost as if you're talking to a lawyer. We're stepping the student through what they should do. And there's a general document, and the general document, so step 1, step 2, step 3, and it talks about the TPS. It talks about how to get your records. It talks about damages. So I think you'd follow those steps. If during those steps you're having any difficulties, then absolutely make an appointment to speak with a lawyer. The International Student Legal Service is a statewide service within New South Wales.
I didn't.
So
I think a lot of students might not know that. They might just think it's for people who are studying in Sydney.
No. So it's a statewide service. So anybody can engage with us on any issues that they're experiencing. I think other community legal centres certainly would be able to provide advice as well, but certainly our recommendation would be try to exhaust the avenues on the fact sheets, the resources that we've provided. If thereafter you still need assistance, then yes. I think to your point with reference to calculating your losses, I think that's probably slightly more complicated, and it'd be very hard. So, it would have been hard for us to put it in a fact sheet because everybody's situation is likely to be different.
Yeah. So I think the fact sheets are a really important resource for everyone to follow through, as Sean mentioned. You can download them. They have the links there to take you to the TPS, to ASQA, I think.
Yep.
We've also got the template letter we spoke about to send to the administrator if your college is closed down. Is there anything else that's really important for the students whose college is being affected by a closure or partial closure? Is there one thing that we think is the most important thing, Sean?
I think COE is going to be the most important thing, having that valid enrolment, because it's so tied to the student visa, that I think that would be the most important thing. So act quickly, I think is what we're saying. TPS, because they're government, obviously they communicate with other government departments as well. So there's certainly some value in dealing with TPS, and they are there to look at your best interests. Now, it may not be that they have the exact education provider that you want. So that's where you have that option that you could source it yourself. So keeping in mind, time constraints and, valid COEs, I think you can certainly look for your own, but you would probably, just be mindful that you need to ensure that your education provider has given you that COE. Yeah.
And I think that if you do need that help, as Sean mentioned, to contact Redfern Legal Centre and make an appointment to speak with us.
Now, I can see we've got a question there with reference to TPS. There is the question was asking, how do we contact TPS? If you navigate to our website, you will find that there's some hyperlinks within that document. So that will actually navigate you to TPS and how to engage with TPS. There was another question that spoke about how much can they recover potentially from an education provider. I think, as we say, I mean, that's difficult to give a definitive. If an education provider has partially fulfilled its obligations, so if you've received I'm going to use just a hypothetical. So if your course of studies was for 3 years, and you received 2 years of that course of studies, and you have that recognition of prior learning, so you have all of your documentation, which enables you to continue your studies, you couldn't claim those last 2 years because you've received something of value. You've got that recognition of prior learning. It's fulfilled part of your requirements to learn that particular course, that subject matter. If the following year, so we said that you've completed 2, but there was a year remaining, if that year remaining is costing you more for whatever reasons, then potentially you might be able to bring a claim against that education provider because their failure has meant that it's costing you more money. I think where that becomes problematic, as Peter was talking on earlier, is what if the education provider isn't trading anymore? Then it becomes,
it's complicated.
so difficult, and I'm not going to say impossible, but certainly more difficult. Even if you engaged with the administrator and said, I'm demanding this 1 year because it's costing me X amount more, and it would only be the amount that is costing you more. The likelihood is you're sitting so low in their priority, the administrator's priority, that you likely wouldn't recover those monies. But I think our advice would be seek legal advice on that. If the entity is still trading, so if the education provider is still trading, then that might be slightly different. So you may be able to bring a claim. Are there any more questions on there?
I think we've covered over most things, and anything we haven't covered over, as we said, you can download the fact sheets from the Redfern Legal Centre website.
Yep. Oh, there's a question: is the service free? It is. I should perhaps have started.
We always forget that.
with that. So, Redfern Legal Centre is, as we mentioned at the beginning, funded by Study in New South Wales, and we provide free legal advice to all international students enrolled to study in New South Wales. So yes, it is a free service.
So, Sean, if the students also have some other issues, not just about their education provider, what sort of other things could they come to us to talk about?
Yeah, so we're, I suppose the best way to describe it is generalist practice, legal practice, which means we advise on any legal issue. Now, I'm going to put a little bit of a disclaimer on that, is we wouldn't advise on wills and estate. That's an area that we don't advise on, and generally we wouldn't advise on personal injury claims. But other than that, we advise on anything. If you want to have an appointment with us, if you were to navigate to Redfern Legal Centre, you'll find on their main page that is make an appointment. Just click on that and you just fill in a little bit of your details, what the issue is that you're experiencing, and we will then contact you via email. Thank you to all of those who joined us tonight. We're very grateful, and for those that are watching this in the future. Thank you all very much.